My name is Eleanor Grace Whitmore. I am 78 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I understood the meaning of family. I thought blood was thicker than water. I thought that no matter how much pain or misunderstanding might come between a mother and her children, there would always be a thread of love strong enough to hold us together. But on that rainy Tuesday afternoon, as I sat in the polished mahogany room of Masterson and Boyd law offices, my only daughter looked me dead in the eye and whispered through clenched teeth, "Don't expect a dime from Dad's $150 million. She didn't even bother lowering her voice enough to hide the venom. Her words were sharp, slicing right through the thin hope I'd been holding on to. All around us, the room was filled with the quiet shuffle of papers, the scent of old leather, and the hum of an air conditioner that seemed far too cold for May. My late husband's attorney, Mr. Boyd, adjusted his glasses and tapped the manila folder in front of him. And then, like a slow knife, he began to read the will. The air shifted the moment my name left his mouth. To my beloved wife, Eleanor Grace Whitmore. My daughter, Caroline, froze. The color drained from her face so quickly, it was almost frightening. I could see her knuckles tighten around the edge of the chair. Her husband, David, glanced at her with raised eyebrows, clearly confused. Caroline didn't even look at him. Her eyes were fixed on me, wide and wild, as though she'd just seen a ghost step into the room. And I just sat there, hands folded in my lap, heart pounding in my chest, waiting for the rest of the sentence that would shatter everything she thought she knew. But before Mr. Boyd spoke again, Caroline's hand darted out, touching his arm. "Wait," she said quickly, her voice trembling. Can we talk about this privately?" Mr. Boyd's brows furrowed. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Clark, that a will reading is a legal proceeding. Everyone named in the will is entitled to hear it." And then, in that heavy silence, he continued. What he read next made Caroline's lips part in disbelief. Her head turned toward me, and for the first time in years, I saw something I never thought I'd see in her eyes. Not anger, not disdain, but fear. I'll tell you exactly what was in that will, but first you need to understand how a mother and daughter can go from love to loathing. It didn't start with money. No, money only poured gasoline on the fire. It started long before the $150 million, long before the gold watches and the private planes and the real estate portfolio. It started with little things I ignored because I wanted to keep my family whole. But I should have known the people closest to you can betray you in ways strangers never could. Back when my husband, Richard Whitmore, was alive, Caroline had always been difficult. As a child, she wanted everything her way. As a teenager, she was wild and entitled, often using Richard's wealth to bend the world to her will. I told myself she would grow out of it. She didn't. She grew into it. By the time she married David, a man with ambition but no integrity, she had perfected the art of manipulation. Richard adored her, but he also feared her sharp tongue and unpredictable temper. He gave in to her demands more often than he should have. I didn't know then that it was training her for the day when she would try to erase me from the picture entirely. When Richard got sick, Caroline was at our house more often, but not to care for him. She hovered in his study, helping with his paperwork, organizing his files, always shooing me away. I thought she was being responsible. I didn't realize she was preparing for the day she would tell me I was worth nothing to this family. The day Richard passed was the day Caroline's mask came off completely. She didn't cry. She didn't hold my hand. She simply called me into the kitchen and said, "You know Dad wouldn't want you to live in that big house all alone. You should start looking for something smaller." Smaller? I'd built every corner of that house with my hands and my heart. The memories in those walls were my life. But Caroline's words were ice. And as for the will, she added, "Don't expect a dime from Dad's $150 million. He already made it clear where his priorities were." She said it with such certainty that I almost believed her. Almost. But I had been married to Richard for 54 years. I knew the sound of his promises, and I knew he wouldn't leave me with nothing. Still, the seed of doubt was planted, and she wanted it to grow. For weeks, she avoided talking about the will, telling me the reading was complicated and delayed. But I began to notice things, like her meeting with the lawyer without me, or moving documents from the safe to her car. I started keeping quiet, pretending to be the gullible old woman she thought I was, while I kept my own counsel. And then came that Tuesday afternoon. I walked into the law office, knowing something Caroline didn't know. She thought she was about to humiliate me. She thought she had arranged everything so she and David would walk away with everything Richard had built. She didn't know I'd had my own meeting with Richard's attorney 2 months before he passed. She didn't know my name was written where hers should have been. When Mr. Boyd said, "To my beloved wife, Eleanor Grace Whitmore," Caroline's world tilted. She didn't know whether to scream or faint. And when he continued, her carefully crafted empire began to crumble. But you see, that was only the beginning. Because what was written in that will was not just about money. It was about revenge. It was about a husband who saw through his daughter's greed before it was too late. And it was about a mother who had finally decided she wouldn't be erased from her own life. And when Caroline realized that, she didn't just turn pale. She began to plot. What she did next is the reason this story doesn't end in that lawyer's office. Because sometimes, when you think you've won, the real war is just beginning. If you think hearing my name in that will was the most shocking thing to happen that day, you have no idea what was waiting for me when I walked out of that office. 2 months before Richard died, I woke in the middle of the night to find him sitting in the study, the soft golden light from the desk lamp pooling over a stack of papers. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through a file, and I noticed the oxygen tube hanging loosely by his side instead of under his nose. "You shouldn't be up," I whispered, pulling my robe tighter as I stepped into the room. He glanced up at me with those sharp blue eyes that had seen boardrooms, hostile takeovers, and political dinners, and yet they were softer when they rested on me. "Ellie," he said quietly, "we need to talk. Now." It wasn't unusual for Richard to discuss business late at night, but the urgency in his tone was different. This wasn't about a deal or a contract. This was about our family. He motioned me closer, and when I sat across from him, he slid a manila envelope toward me. I didn't open it immediately. "What is this?" I asked. "It's my will," he said simply. "The real one." My heart lurched. "The real one?" He leaned back in his chair, his breath shallow. "Caroline's been pushing me for months to make changes. She's been bringing me papers to sign when you're not around. Some of them I refused outright. Some I pretended to sign, but I swapped the pages before she could file them. She thinks she's orchestrating everything. She's not." I just sat there, stunned. I'd known Caroline could be manipulative, but the thought of her trying to cut me out entirely, it made my stomach turn. Richard reached over and took my hand. "Ellie, I know I wasn't the perfect husband. I spoiled her. I gave in to her demands too often. I let her talk to you in ways no daughter should speak to her mother. That's on me. But I won't let her erase you." He gestured toward the envelope. "I've arranged it so that certain assets, very specific ones, go directly to you, no matter what anyone tries to contest. And not just money. Control. Influence. The kind of leverage that will keep you safe even after I'm gone." I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a document that not only named me as the primary beneficiary of several major holdings, but also gave me voting rights over the Whitmore Family Trust. Caroline's name appeared further down the list, her inheritance tied to conditions that, knowing her, she would never fulfill. I looked up at him. "Richard, this will cause a war." His lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. Maybe then she'll learn something about respect." For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the papers. And then, in a voice so low I almost missed it, Richard said, "One more thing. You can't tell her. Let her think she's won until the very end." That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to the steady hum of the oxygen machine, wondering how a daughter could turn against her mother so coldly. And I realized Caroline hadn't become this way overnight. When she was young, I'd overlooked her sharp edges because I believed love would soften them. When she married David, I hoped his steadiness would ground her. Instead, he encouraged her ambition in the worst ways. Together, They became a team, not to build something, but to take. The weeks after that conversation were a blur of hospital visits, hushed phone calls, and tense dinners where Caroline smiled too sweetly and asked too many questions about bank accounts. She even began hinting that I should downsize and simplify my life. At first, I thought she was just being careless with her words. But then I noticed her dropping comments to the staff, asking about where certain documents were kept or which safe I used most often. One morning, I caught her in Richard's study while he slept upstairs. She had one of his file drawers open and a phone in her hand, snapping pictures. When she saw me, she didn't flinch. "Just organizing Dad's things," she said, her voice dripping with false innocence. I should have confronted her then. But Richard's warning echoed in my mind. Let her think she's won. So I smiled and asked if she wanted tea. By the time Richard passed, Caroline was convinced she had secured everything for herself and David. She avoided me in the days leading up to the will reading, only texting once to tell me the date and time. When I asked if she knew what was in it, she replied, "Don't expect a dime from Dad's $150 million. You'll be fine, Mom. You've got your knitting and your garden." I remember staring at that message until my vision blurred, wondering how she could dismiss my life like that, as though my worth had been reduced to a hobby and a patch of roses. But I kept my silence. The morning of the will reading, I dressed in my best navy suit, the one Richard always said made me look like I could run the whole company if I wanted to. I arrived 10 minutes early, and Mr. Boyd greeted me with a warmth that made Caroline's frosty arrival moments later even more jarring. She didn't even say hello, just adjusted her pearl earrings and whispered to David, "This won't take long." If only she knew. When Mr. Boyd began reading, I watched her face the way a sailor watches the sky before a storm. And when my name came first, I saw the clouds gather in her eyes. But here's what I didn't expect. Caroline didn't crumble. She didn't cry. She straightened in her chair, her mind already spinning. And by the time the reading ended, she was smiling again. Not a smile of peace, a smile of plotting. And I realized right then, this wasn't over. What she did next made it clear that she wasn't just going to let this go. In fact, within 24 hours, I would discover just how far my own daughter was willing to go to take what wasn't hers. The day after the will reading, the phone calls began. At first, I didn't answer them. Unknown numbers, one after the other, lighting up the phone in my kitchen. But when my voicemail filled up and the calls didn't stop, I finally listened. It was the bank. Then the insurance company. Then Richard's yacht broker. All with the same tone. Polite, professional, but laced with confusion. "Mrs. Whitmore, we received a request from your daughter, Caroline Clark, to transfer your accounts into her name. Mrs. Whitmore, we've had someone claiming to have power of attorney over your estate. Mrs. Whitmore, can you confirm you authorized your daughter to sell your late husband's yacht?" By the fourth message, my hands were shaking. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. Caroline had walked out of that lawyer's office yesterday, looked me dead in the eye, and smiled. And now she was coming for everything she'd just learned she couldn't have. I drove straight to Mr. Boyd's office. He was in the middle of a meeting, but when his secretary saw my face, she ushered me right in. "She's trying to override the will," I said before I'd even sat down. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I suspected she might. I've already had calls from some of the institutions you just mentioned. Don't worry, Mrs. Whitmore, nothing will go through. The documents Richard signed are airtight." But he hesitated. "You need to understand something. This isn't just about legal maneuvering anymore. Caroline will look for other ways to force your hand." "What do you mean, other ways?" I asked. He gave me a look I didn't like. Pressure, isolation, emotional manipulation. "She may try to make your life so unbearable that you willingly sign things over just to get her out of your hair." I thought back to the years of little jabs, the way she'd chip away at me in private but act sweet as pie in public. If she was willing to pull this at her own father's funeral, I had no doubt she'd try to break me. Sure enough, the first strike came that evening. I had just finished watering the hydrangeas when I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway. Caroline's SUV stopped right in front of the porch, and she stepped out in 4-inch heels like she was arriving at a gala. David followed behind her, carrying a thick manila folder. "Mom," she said, flashing that same bright smile she'd worn in the lawyer's office. "We need to talk." I didn't move from the porch. If this is about the will, there's nothing to discuss. "Oh, this isn't about the will," she said, climbing the steps until she was just a few feet away. "This is about your living arrangements. You're almost 80, Mom. That house is too big for you. Too many stairs. Too many rooms to maintain. David and I have been talking, and we think it would be best for you to move into something more manageable." "I'm managing just fine," I replied. David stepped forward, holding out the folder. "We've already found a lovely assisted living facility. 5-star reviews, beautiful grounds. You'd have your own room, your meals prepared, staff to help with." I cut him off.
No.
Caroline's smile tightened. "Mom, don't be stubborn. This isn't safe for you anymore. You could fall. You could forget to turn off the stove. And besides," she tilted her head, "you don't want to rattle around here all alone, do you?" The implication was clear. You don't deserve to be here. "I'm not alone," I said evenly. "I have friends. I have a life. And I have the legal right to stay right here." For a moment, the mask slipped. Her smile vanished, and her eyes went cold. "That can change." Then, as quickly as it came, the smile returned. "Think about it, Mom. We'll talk again soon." She and David walked back to their car without another word. I stood there on the porch, watching the taillights disappear down the drive, my heart pounding. I knew what she meant. And 2 days later, I got proof. It started small. The gardener I'd employed for 20 years called to say he'd been told his services were no longer needed. The cleaning woman stopped showing up. Then my delivery groceries failed to arrive. When I called to check, the manager told me my daughter had updated my account and canceled the service. She was trying to strip away my comfort, one piece at a time. I thought about Richard's words. Let her think she's won until the very end. But a gnawing worry began to grow in my gut. If she was willing to manipulate banks, cancel services, and push me toward a nursing home, what would she try next? That night, I locked every door and window. And it's a good thing I did, because just before midnight, I heard it, the soft creak of the back porch boards. Someone was out there. The sound was faint at first, the kind of noise you might dismiss as the wind or an old house settling. But my home had stood for over 60 years, and I knew every groan in its bones. This was different. The boards on the back porch let out a slow, deliberate creak, followed by the soft metallic jingle of the screen door's chain being tested. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed still in the armchair by the living room window, lights off, my eyes fixed on the shadow moving past the kitchen. The figure was tall, deliberate, and moving like someone who didn't want to be heard. My first instinct was to grab the phone. But then I saw the glint of light from the porch as the back door knob turned. Once, twice. A faint curse hissed through the air. Whoever it was, they were trying to get in. I moved quietly to the kitchen doorway, my bare feet silent on the carpet. My phone was in my hand, but I didn't call 911 yet. Instead, I flipped on the kitchen light. The figure froze. And there, standing on my back porch in the middle of the night, was David. For a long moment, we just stared at each other through the glass. His face was twisted into something halfway between a smirk and a grimace. "David." My voice came out sharper than I intended. "What the hell are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped the window gently with his knuckle. "Eleanor, open the door. We need to talk."
About what?
At midnight? On my porch. His eyes flicked to the corner of the kitchen where Richard's old filing cabinet stood. "About the future. Caroline and we think you're making a mistake." I tightened my grip on the phone. "You think sneaking into my house at night is going to change my mind?" He sighed and rubbed his forehead, as though I were the unreasonable one. "I didn't want to do this here, but we've been talking to some people. Lawyers. We can contest the will, you know. If we can prove you're not capable of managing this estate, the court will take over. And believe me, Eleanor, they'll listen to your daughter before they listen to you." My blood went cold. This wasn't just about money anymore. They were setting up the groundwork to declare me incompetent, to take not just the estate, but my dignity, my autonomy. I stepped closer to the glass, letting my voice drop into that tone I used when Caroline was a child and pushing boundaries. David, if you take one more step toward that door, I will call the police. And when I do, they will hear from me exactly why you're here. Now leave. For a second, I thought he might try to push it. But then, without a word, he stepped back, pulled his jacket tighter, and walked into the dark. I stood there long after the sound of his footsteps faded. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking. The next morning, I called Mr. Boyd and told him everything. He didn't sound surprised. This is exactly what I warned you about. They're going to escalate. You need to protect yourself, not just legally, but physically. Change your locks, install cameras, and keep every interaction documented. If they try to claim you're incompetent, we'll bury them in evidence of your independence. I did as he said. I had a locksmith come out that afternoon. I ordered security cameras for every entrance. I even asked my neighbor, Margaret, to check in on me twice a day. But Caroline wasn't done. 2 days later, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words typed in bold capital letters. Sell the house. No signature. No explanation. Just those 3 words, as if they were an order. I knew the handwriting on the envelope, though. Caroline had addressed enough birthday cards to me over the years for me to recognize the way she curved her capital E's. And if there was any doubt, it vanished that evening when I checked my new security cameras and saw her standing at the edge of my driveway, staring at the house. She didn't walk up. She didn't knock. She just stood there, her face pale in the glow of the street lamp, before getting back into her car and driving away. It was becoming clear that she wasn't just trying to push me out, she was trying to intimidate me. But here's the thing. I had Richard's will. I had the law. And I had something Caroline didn't know about, a safeguard Richard had put in place that would make it impossible for her to take what wasn't hers. I wasn't ready to use it yet, but soon she would give me no choice. And when I did, it would end her game forever. The morning after I saw Caroline at the end of my driveway, I knew I couldn't just sit back and react anymore. She was tightening her net around me, hoping I'd panic and make a mistake. But if Richard taught me anything in our 54 years together, it was this. The person who moves last often moves best. I made tea, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the locked drawer where I kept the manila envelope Richard had given me 2 months before his death. Inside was not just the will, but something else he'd slipped in that night without explaining. A separate letter, handwritten in his unmistakable blocky script. Ellie, it began, if you're reading this, it means Caroline has shown her true colors. I've known for some time she's been working against you, and I've taken steps to make sure she can't touch what matters most. Enclosed, you'll find the documents for Whitmore Holdings LLC, a company she doesn't even know exists. It owns not only the house, but the lake property, the vineyard, and the controlling shares in Whitmore Enterprises. Your name is the only one on it. If she tries to take anything, you have the legal authority to shut her out completely. My breath caught. I remembered the quiet way he'd watched her during those last months, the way he'd winced when she raised her voice to me. He hadn't just written me into the will, he'd built a fortress around me. And then came the final line of the letter, written with a deliberate hand. Don't confront her until she's gone far enough to bury herself. That sentence kept echoing in my head as I started putting my plan together. First, I called Mr. Boyd and told him about the LLC. His pause on the other end of the line was long enough to make me nervous. Then he said, Mrs. Whitmore, this changes everything. With this in place, you don't just inherit, you control. And if they so much as touch a blade of grass on your property, we can have them arrested for trespassing. The first move was to secure the house. I had the locksmith install deadbolts that required a key from both sides. I added 2 more security cameras, one at the end of the driveway and another pointed toward the back garden. My neighbor, Margaret, became my unofficial lookout. She had no love for Caroline, and she promised to call me if she saw even a shadow near the house. But Caroline didn't show herself for nearly a week. Not in person. Instead, I started getting phone calls from friends, people I hadn't heard from in years, suddenly asking if I was doing all right, if I was sure I could handle the property at my age. It was all the same language Caroline had been using. She was building a case, whisper by whisper, that I was too fragile to manage my affairs. I played along, keeping my voice calm, even telling a few of them I'd been feeling a bit tired lately. I wanted her to think her plan was working. But behind the scenes, I was documenting everything: the canceled services, the threats, the midnight visit from David. I even had copies of the threatening note and screenshots from the security cameras showing her at the driveway. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find the back gate wide open. The latch had been snapped clean off, and muddy footprints trailed across the flagstone path to my kitchen door. Inside, nothing seemed out of place, except for the open cabinet where I kept my late husband's personal journals. They weren't valuable in money, but they were priceless to me. And now 3 of them were missing. My chest tightened, and I felt a wave of cold rage I hadn't felt in years. She'd crossed from intimidation into outright theft. That evening, I called Mr. Boyd. "It's time," I said. "She's gone far enough." "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "And when this is over, she'll wish she'd left me with nothing. Because what I'm about to do isn't just going to take back what's mine. It's going to take everything she thought she already had." I didn't tell him then, but I'd already set the wheels in motion. I'd contacted an old friend of Richard's, a man who still sat on the board of Whitmore Enterprises. And the document Richard left me gave me the power to call an emergency board meeting. By the time Caroline found out, the ink would already be dry. What she didn't know was that her inheritance wasn't the only thing she stood to lose. The call from Richard's old friend, Charles Whitaker, came early in the morning. His voice was gravelly with age, but sharp as a blade. "I got your message, Eleanor," he said. "And I saw the documents Richard left you. You're not just an heir. You're a controlling partner. That means if you want a board meeting, you'll get one." I told him what Caroline and David had been doing: the canceled services, the late-night prowling, the attempt to sell off assets they didn't own. Charles was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, I could hear the controlled anger in his tone. "Richard was like a brother to me," he said. "He trusted you to protect his legacy. If she's trying to undermine you, she's trying to undermine the company. And that, Eleanor, that I won't allow." 2 days later, I walked into the glass-walled conference room of Whitmore Enterprises. I hadn't been there in years, not since Richard's retirement. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne. Around the massive table sat the board, men and women in suits who had built empires alongside my husband. And at the far end, to my absolute lack of surprise, sat Caroline. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her hair was perfectly styled, her pearl earrings gleaming, and David was right beside her in a tailored suit. They were talking to one of the junior partners, laughing as though they belonged there. When Caroline saw me, her smile faltered just for a second, then came back, brighter and sharper. "Mother," she said sweetly, "I didn't know you'd be attending today." I set my leather-bound folder on the table and met her gaze evenly. I called this meeting. The silence that followed was almost delicious. Charles cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, Eleanor Whitmore holds controlling shares through Whitmore Holdings LLC. Per her request, we're convening to address breaches of trust concerning estate matters and unauthorized interference with company assets." Caroline's smile didn't fade, but her knuckles whitened around the pen in her hand. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I've simply been helping my mother with decisions she might find overwhelming at her age." I opened my folder and began sliding documents across the table: copies of the threatening note, the screenshots from my security cameras, the bank statements showing attempted transfers, and a notarized statement from my gardener about being fired under false pretenses. "This," I said calmly, "is not help. This is sabotage. And per the terms Richard set in motion, anyone engaging in actions that compromise the estate or the company's reputation is subject to removal from any and all beneficiary status connected to Whitmore Enterprises." There was a murmur around the table. One of the older board members leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you saying you intend to strip your daughter of her shares?" I didn't look at Caroline when I said it. Yes. The explosion came instantly. You can't do that. Caroline snapped, her voice rising. This is my family's company. Dad wanted integrity. I cut in, my tone like steel. And you've shown you don't have any. Charles banged the gavel they used for votes. All those in favor of honoring Mrs. Whitmore's request? Hands went up around the table, one by one. All but Caroline's, of course. The vote passed unanimously. It was over in less than 10 minutes. Caroline's shares, the ones she thought guaranteed her a lifetime of wealth and influence, were now frozen, pending permanent transfer back into the trust one controlled. She sat there, stunned, her face pale and her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. David whispered something in her ear, but she didn't move. When the meeting adjourned, I gathered my papers and walked past her without a word. But just as I reached the door, she spoke. You think this is the end? Her voice was low, trembling with rage. You've humiliated me in front of people I need. You've made me look weak. You have no idea what you've started. I turned back and looked her squarely in the eye. No, Caroline.
You started this.
I'm just making sure it ends the right way. I left the building with my head high, but as I stepped into the elevator, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline. I'd just struck the first blow, and it had landed hard. But I knew Caroline.
She wouldn't retreat.
She'd come back swinging. And when she did, it wouldn't just be with lawyers and whispers. It would be personal, and I had to be ready. I had expected Caroline to lash out after the boardroom blow, but I underestimated just how far she'd go, and how fast. It started less than 48 hours later. I was in the middle of making breakfast when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was ice. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Officer Jennings with the county police. We've received a report about potential elder neglect and unsafe living conditions at your residence. We're going to need to conduct an inspection this morning. For a moment, I couldn't even respond. Elder neglect? Unsafe living conditions? My home was spotless, my bills paid, my pantry full. But I knew exactly where this was coming from. When the officers arrived an hour later, they weren't hostile, but they were thorough. They checked the locks, the pantry, the bathrooms. They even looked in the medicine cabinet to verify expiration dates. By the time they left, it was clear they'd found nothing. One officer even gave me a sympathetic look. Ma'am, I'm not supposed to say this, but these kinds of calls usually come from family. I thanked him, shut the door, and sat at the kitchen table, my tea going cold. Caroline wasn't just spreading whispers now. She was trying to create a paper trail. If she could make it look like I couldn't care for myself, she could petition for guardianship and take control of everything Richard had left me. That afternoon, I drove straight to Mr. Boyd's office. She's making false reports, I told him. She's trying to build a case. His eyes narrowed. Then we need to build a stronger one. We spent the next hour putting together a file, notarized statements from neighbors, receipts showing my independent finances, even footage from the security cameras proving I lived alone and handled my daily routines without assistance. Every time she moves, he said, you counter. And you document. The more she pushes, the more she buries herself. But Caroline wasn't done pushing. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of glass shattering. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the phone, ready to call 911, and crept toward the sound. In the dining room, one of the side windows was cracked open, the shards glittering on the floor. And standing there, halfway inside, was a man I didn't recognize, tall, broad, wearing a dark hoodie. He froze when he saw me, then bolted. I called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. Nothing was stolen, at least nothing I could see. But when the officers took my statement, one of them asked a question that sent a chill down my spine. Do you have any family disputes going on, ma'am? Sometimes break-ins like this aren't about theft. They're about intimidation. I didn't answer directly, but I thought of David, of the way he'd stood on my porch at midnight and talked about making my life easier, of the fact that he was big enough to match the silhouette I'd seen. The next day, I got another letter, This time hand-delivered, tucked under my front doormat. This isn't over. Sell the house. No signature. No envelope. Just those words, in the same typeface as the first note. I didn't need a handwriting expert to know who sent it. I realized then that Caroline's war had two fronts: the legal battle, which she was losing, and the personal one, where she was willing to use fear as her weapon. What she didn't know was that I'd already decided how to end both. I called Charles, told him to set up another board meeting, one that would finalize the transfer of her frozen shares permanently into the trust under my sole control. But that was only part of it. I also reached out to an old contact of Richard's, a retired investigator named Henry Cole. Henry had worked corporate cases for decades, and he knew exactly how to dig up the kind of evidence that could destroy a person's reputation beyond repair. "I'll find everything," he told me over the phone. "If she's been scheming with her husband, if she's moved assets, made shady deals, harassed you, we'll have it all documented. And when we hand it over, she won't just lose the inheritance. She'll be lucky if she doesn't end up in court herself." For the first time in weeks, I slept well that night. But my relief didn't last long. The next evening, I came home from a visit with Margaret to find the front door ajar. My stomach tightened as I stepped inside. The air felt wrong. And then I saw it, the manila envelope on my coffee table. The one with Richard's original will and the LLC documents. The lock on the drawer had been forced. The envelope was open. The papers were gone. I stood in the center of my living room, staring at the empty space where Richard's safeguard should have been. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, panic threatened to take over. Without those papers, the protection Richard had built for me would be far harder to prove. It wouldn't erase my control. Mr. Boyd still had copies, but it would slow everything down. And that was exactly what Caroline wanted. I forced myself to take a deep breath. I looked around the room carefully, noting every detail. There were no signs of forced entry at the front door, which meant whoever had come in had either picked the lock or had a key. My mind went immediately to two people: Caroline, David. Both had been in this house enough times over the years to know where I kept the most important things. Both had motive, but only one of them had the arrogance to leave behind a clue. On the coffee table, right where the envelope had been, was a faint ring, the kind of glass leaves behind when it's been set down without a coaster. Caroline had always done that. Even when she was a teenager, she'd put her drinks on the wood, without caring, knowing it drove me crazy. David, for all his faults, wasn't that careless. So it was her. And if she'd taken the documents herself, that meant she hadn't passed them off to a lawyer yet, which meant they were close. I called Henry Cole, the retired investigator, and told him exactly what happened. "She's sloppy," he said. "That's good. Sloppy means predictable. Don't chase her, set bait. She's already shown you she can't resist poking the bear. Let's give her something to take." By the next morning, we had a plan. I pulled an identical manila envelope from my office supply cabinet and filled it with papers that looked important: stock transfer forms, bank statements, even a photocopy of Richard's will. But all of them were fakes, doctored just enough to look real but worthless in court. Henry installed a small tracking device inside the envelope, the kind that could send us its location in real time. Then, I placed it in the same drawer where I'd kept the originals, with the lock repaired, just enough to tempt someone who thought they could break it again. All I had to do was wait. 2 nights later, it happened. The security camera on my back porch pinged my phone at 11:42 p.m. The motion alert showed Caroline, wearing a black hoodie, glancing around before slipping inside through the back door. She moved straight to the drawer, just like before, and in less than 30 seconds, she had the fake envelope in her bag. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I wanted her to think she'd won. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Henry was sending me updates from his laptop. "She's moving. The tracker's live. She just went into David's office downtown." An hour later, he called again. "You're going to want to see this." He sent me a video file. In it, Caroline sat across from a man I didn't recognize, not a lawyer, but someone who looked like he belonged in the shadows. She slid the envelope across the table. He opened it, flipped through the pages, and frowned. Caroline leaned in, speaking quickly, clearly trying to convince him of something. He shook his head. Henry's voice crackled through the line. That's not just some stranger. That's a broker, the kind who moves assets quietly overseas. She's not just trying to take your inheritance. She's trying to liquidate it. The pit in my stomach hardened into something cold and solid. She wasn't content with destroying me in court. She wanted to make sure there was nothing left for me to fight for. Henry and I met with Mr. Boyd that afternoon. We laid out the footage, the tracking data, the fake documents, the timeline. Mr. Boyd's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the evidence. This, he said finally, is enough to bury her.
Fraud.
Attempted theft. Conspiracy. If we hand this to the right people, she won't just lose her claim. She'll be facing criminal charges. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it sink in.
Not yet, I said. They both looked at me.
I want her to walk into the next board meeting thinking she's still in control. I want her to smile that smug little smile she always has. And then I want her to realize, in front of everyone, that she's finished. Mr. Boyd's lips twitched into something like approval. You have a streak of Richard in you after all. We set the meeting for the following week.
I didn't tell Caroline.
I wanted the summons to arrive by courier, formal and impossible to ignore. But the night before it was due to be delivered, I got another surprise. I was in the kitchen when I heard tires crunching on the gravel driveway. I peeked out the window and froze. Caroline's SUV was parked right in front of the porch. She was sitting inside, hands gripping the wheel, staring at the house like she was deciding whether to come in or run it over. She didn't move for a full 5 minutes. Then, slowly, she stepped out holding something in her hand. It was the original manila envelope, and she was walking toward my door. The knock on my front door was sharp, impatient, and completely out of place for someone holding the evidence of their own crime. I stood just inside, my hand hovering over the knob, every instinct telling me to keep the barrier between us. But curiosity and something colder made me turn it. When the door opened, Caroline stood there in the morning light, her perfect hair slightly undone, her face pale but tight with forced composure. In her hands, clutched so tightly the edges were bent, was the original manila envelope Richard had given me. Here, she said, thrusting it toward me like it was on fire. Take it. I didn't move to grab it. Why are you bringing it back now? She shifted her weight, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. Because it doesn't matter anymore. Keep your little papers, your LLC, your precious control. I'm done with it. Her tone was wrong. Too clipped. Too rehearsed. Caroline never gave up without getting something in return. You're not done, I said quietly. You're scared. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time in months, I saw it, the smallest crack in her armor. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room.
Come in.
Let's talk. She hesitated, but then walked past me, her heels clicking against the hardwood. I closed the door and followed her, keeping my distance. She set the envelope on the coffee table, in the exact same spot she'd taken it from, and folded her arms. Look, she said, her voice low. I don't know what you think you've got on me, but whatever it is, it's not worth dragging this out. We both know Dad wanted me taken care of. If you'd just be reasonable. I cut her off. I have footage of you breaking into this house. Of you handing those documents to a broker who moves assets offshore. I have bank statements showing your attempts to transfer funds that weren't yours. I have every threatening note, every canceled service, every visit from so-called concerned friends. Her lips tightened. You wouldn't. I leaned forward, my voice steady. I will. And when I do, you won't just lose your inheritance. You'll lose your reputation, your friends, and maybe your freedom. For a long moment, she just stared at me, breathing hard. Then, slowly, her arms dropped to her sides. You think you've won, she said, her voice trembling. But you haven't.
You've humiliated me.
In front of people who matter. You've taken what's mine. What's yours? I repeated, my voice sharpening. Richard built this. I stood beside him every step of the way. You had every opportunity to earn his trust, and you threw it away chasing more. You could have had a place at the table. Instead, you tried to take the whole house. Something in her expression shifted. For a brief second, I thought she might apologize. But then her mouth curled into the faintest smile. "You'll regret this," she said softly. "Not today, but soon." With that, she turned on her heel, walked to the door, and left, the slam echoing through the house. I stood there, staring at the envelope on the table. Henry's voice echoed in my mind. Sloppy means predictable. She hadn't returned it because she wanted to give up. She'd returned it because she thought it would throw me off balance. But it wouldn't, because tomorrow was the board meeting. And tomorrow was when I'd end this. Mr. Boyd already had the package prepared, the footage, the documents, the statements. Charles had confirmed the entire board would be present. And Henry had something extra, something I hadn't even asked for. Proof that Caroline and David had been moving small sums into an offshore account for months, likely preparing for a bigger transfer once they got control of the estate. It would all come out.
Publicly. Permanently.
That night, I didn't lock the original envelope away. I left it right there on the table, in plain sight, as a reminder, to myself and to her, if she was foolish enough to try again, that I was ready. But just before dawn, my phone buzzed with a message from Henry. "Eleanor, we have a problem. The broker she met with? He's connected to someone on the board." Henry's message about the broker's connection to someone on the board gnawed at me all night. If the man Caroline had met was tied to one of the directors, that meant there was a leak, someone in the room who might try to shield her from the consequences. But there was no time to rewrite my plan. The meeting was hours away, and if I delayed, I risked losing the momentum I'd built. I arrived at Whitmore Enterprises with Mr. Boyd at my side and Henry waiting in the lobby. The air in the boardroom was tense. Everyone was already seated, and Caroline, dressed in a sharp cream suit and dripping with diamonds, was smiling like she'd already won. Charles banged the gavel. "This emergency meeting has been called by Mrs. Whitmore to address serious breaches of trust involving a beneficiary of the estate. All members, please note this session will be recorded." Caroline leaned back in her chair, her fingers laced, her eyes locked on me. "Before my mother starts her little performance," she said, "I'd like to remind everyone that personal grudges shouldn't influence corporate governance. This is a business, and the board's role is to protect it from bad decisions." I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I opened the folder Mr. Boyd had prepared and began sliding copies of the evidence down the table, the threatening notes, the bank transfer attempts, the security footage of her breaking into my home. The murmurs started immediately. Then I pressed the button on the small remote Henry had given me. The screen at the end of the boardroom lit up with video. Caroline meeting the broker, handing over the stolen documents, leaning in to whisper her plans. Gasps rippled through the room. Caroline's face drained of color, but before she could speak, I played the next clip, a grainy security feed showing her and David in their kitchen, discussing moving assets, before the old woman figures it out. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady, "this isn't just a family dispute. This is fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and a direct attack on the integrity of this company's leadership. Richard trusted this board to protect his legacy. I'm asking you to do exactly that." That's when one of the board members, Paul Ashcroft, slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd. She's your daughter. Are we really going to drag this company's name through the mud over a family squabble?" Henry had warned me there was a connection, and now I saw it plain as day. Paul's defense was too quick, too practiced. "Interesting," I said, meeting his gaze. "Because the broker in that video? He's your cousin. And according to Henry's report, you've done business together for years. Are you sure you want to keep talking?" The room went silent. Paul's face turned red, and Charles banged the gavel again. "This is enough. We have all the information we need." The vote to strip Caroline of all beneficiary rights and permanently transfer her frozen shares into my control passed in minutes. Even Paul abstained, knowing any further protest would only incriminate him. Caroline sat motionless, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. When the decision was announced, she didn't even look at me. She just stood, gathered her bag, and walked out without a word. I watched her go, feeling not triumph exactly, but something cleaner. Relief. Closure. When the meeting adjourned, Charles walked me to the elevator. "Richard would have been proud," he said quietly. "Not because you won, because you stood your ground." That night, back at the house, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The manila envelope was back in my locked drawer, but now it was just a symbol. I didn't need it anymore to feel safe. Caroline hasn't contacted me since that day. From what I hear, she and David left town, their reputation in tatters. The boardroom video found its way into certain hands, and the broker they worked with is under investigation. Sometimes I wonder if she'll ever understand how close she came to having it all, and how quickly she lost it because she couldn't see past her own greed. But mostly I think about Richard, about the quiet way he'd prepared for this, about the way he'd trusted me to finish what he started. And I know, deep down, that I did exactly what I needed to do. Because protecting what's yours isn't just about money. It's about dignity. It's about making sure no one, not even your own blood, can erase you from your own life. And as the evening breeze carried the scent of my blooming hydrangeas across the porch, I smiled. I was still here, still standing, and still in control. If this story reminded you that strength isn't always loud, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be erased, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next story, because your story matters too.